Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. I am Nkechi Nnanna.
And I'm Rufai Yoseni.
Nigeria, the most populous black nation of the world, contributes a significant portion of immigrants worldwide. According to the federal government of Nigeria, there are over 17 million Nigerians in the diaspora.
In the latest white paper, a series of Pricewaterhouse Copers PWC titled Strength from Abroad, the economic power of Nigeria's diaspora estimated that migrant remittances could hit 25.5 billion, 29.8 billion, and 34.8 billion in the year 2021 and 2023.
Pricewaterhouse Copers partner and chief economist Dr. Andrew Nevin says the establishment of Nigerians in Diaspora Commission by the federal government shows that it recognizes the importance of Nigerians in diaspora.
He now joins us for more remittances from Nigerians in diaspora. Great to have you, Andrew, as always. Dr. Andrew Nevin.
Morning, great to be here.
All right, tell us a little bit about this, because this is a very important part of our economy we don't look at, Nigerians in diaspora. In fact, they put more money into this country than the national budget every year. They pretty much run the country.
Well, I mean, we got interested in this because for all the years I've been here, people kept saying we're an oil economy, an oil economy, an oil economy. So we started looking into it, and we actually figured out that more money comes into the country through the diaspora remittances than oil, in fact. It's a bigger contributor. So our biggest export isn't oil. Our biggest export out of Nigeria is actually people. And I think that the way the economy needs to be structured, we need to think about that. And as you said in the opening, we have the Diaspora Commission, but I think there's lots of implications of having such a large and powerful diaspora for Nigeria.
So from your report, it says from 2009, the growth of foreign remittances to Nigeria has been really growing year after year, except maybe from in 2016. What do you think contributes to this growth? Is it that there's a population growth of Nigerians in diaspora, or is it that Nigerians in diaspora are increasing their remittances based on the increase in poverty back in Nigeria here?
Well, I think a few things are going on. I mean, first off, there were a lot of people who left the country, I think in the 1990s or 1980s, educated Nigerians, that wave. They've been more and more successful in their career. They have more and more money. They grew up here. They still have ties here. They've supported it and are sending more. Then we have the new diasporas. So these are, I mean, PWC, we see this in Lagos. You see a big brain drain out of the telecom companies, out of the investment banks, out of the commercial banks, out of people like us, people going particularly to Canada. Now, what happens when you have the young professional is that they go, in the first few years, they're trying to get established. But after that, they then start to send remittances. So what's happened is the ones that went a few years ago are now starting to spend. So you've got the older group who are very successful in their careers, a lot in the US and the UK, and you've got the younger group starting to contribute. So what happens is the diaspora, and of course we have more and more people going into the diaspora every year, professionals. So all in all, it just snowballs over the last decade.
Let's talk about the US a bit, because most of this diaspora money comes from the US. I mean, what's the major cause?
Well, I mean, I think people, we've said this before, but just to reiterate, I mean, the Nigerian diaspora in the United States is incredibly successful. And of course, we've all heard the news in the last 2 weeks about the arrest of, I think, about 80 Nigerians as a result of an internet fraud, and damages the reputation. But actually, the Nigerians in the United States, a very successful diaspora, they earn more than the average American, which is remarkable for a relatively young
Nigerians
person.
in the United States earn more than the average American?
Nigerian Americans earn more than the average American. And Nigerian Americans are, according to what I've read, the most educated group in terms of the percentage that have postgraduate degrees. So particularly medical professions, pharmacists, doctors, very successful, a lot of successful business people. So they're really driving this program, and they want to support Nigeria.
So how much comes out of America, Nigerians in America, Nigerian Americans?
So I think the number this year is going to be about $25 billion officially, and I think over half of it comes from the United States.
$25 billion.
And over half of it comes from
So over half of it, that's well over close to about 12.5, 15 billion.
Right, but even that number, I mean, in the report, we just quoted the official numbers because that's the way it's reported. But I mean, we all know that there's huge unofficial remittance, and it's hard to capture. Why? Because what does an unofficial remittance mean? I mean, the one I'm familiar with is a bogey type system. So you call some guy and you want pounds, you have Naira. So your Naira goes to someone that has Naira needs the opposite way, effectively, right? But no money crosses the border, right? Because Naira is going from one bank account to another, and pounds are going from one bank account to another. So that doesn't get captured. So the World Bank, I think, or maybe the African Development Bank, estimated that number is about 50% of the official remittances. So we might say if the United States had official remittances of 12, 13 billion, they might have another 50% of unofficial remittances.
So that might be about 25 billion in effect, and that might be going to up to about 50 billion if we're going to say, okay, plus informal sector.
Well, I mean, we projected the official remittances would be 35 billion in 2023. So if there was another 50%, it would be over 50 billion. Now, to put this in context, the total import bill in Nigeria is about $40 billion, US dollars. So we always talk about oil, we talk about foreign portfolio investment, we talk about aid, but those numbers are relatively small. The oil is reasonably large, but the aid and even the net portfolio flow are not enough to keep the Naira stable. What's keeping the Naira at 360 is the diaspora remittances.
Now, we've seen that the diaspora is really becoming a growth center for Nigeria's economy. I mean, it contributes to 6.1 of our GDP. It's 10 times or 11 times more than the foreign direct investment. How can the government maybe, are there some policies or interventions that the government can implement in a way to maybe court diaspora, Nigerians in diaspora more? Maybe, for example, start having voting rights for Nigerians in diaspora, maybe something like that, because they're really contributing a lot.
So sort of like inclusion policy.
Exactly.
Right. So I think that, of course, Mrs. Dabiri is the head of the Nigerian Diaspora Commission. I think she's working on a strategy to do this. We've been in discussions. She's obviously seen all of these numbers. So I think people now recognize in the last 6 to 8 months how critical it is. Now, I think from our viewpoint, a couple of things are essential. One is the diaspora right now is a little bit wary of the federal government. And they're sending money directly to individuals they want to support or causes they want to support. 70% of the remittances are for consumption, so very essential things like healthcare, education, feeding, basic feeding in some cases, buying a house for your parents, for example. Those are all very common things. I don't think people want that to be interfered with. But the federal government can do a lot more to sort of include the diaspora, reach out to the diaspora. And of course, part of that would be having a very good electronic presence, so a way that they can do that. But what they don't want to see, I think, is some sort of attempt to control that. But what the federal government can do, now, so 70% I said goes for consumption. In the surveys that DFID have done, the diaspora wants to invest 30% of that money. But it's hard for them to find investments. I mean, sometimes they have investments and it's not quite official, and it goes a bit sideways. They want more structured investments. So the federal government can play a role that helps structure these investments in a way that the diaspora feels like it can put its money in, there's proper monitoring, they're getting information, they know what's happening. Then I think we would see these numbers increase. But I do think it has to be private-led.
Andrew, are you probably thinking of like a diaspora investment commission? But the question is, how will people trust the federal government in this?
Right. So I think, but go back, private-led. So if we look at, I think one of the most successful organizations in the country is the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, right? So it was set up by the federal government. But if you actually look at, I'm not even sure, there may be one government official on the board, but it's private sector driven. They're very professionally run. They're very careful as stewards of capital and investments they need to make. They're trying to figure out, for example, how to unlock some of the pension money, but they're not rushing into that because they recognize the pension money has to be saved. So I think it's a model for something like this. If we could have a private-led group where the federal government was supportive of it and maybe had maybe 1 or 2 representatives, that could work. But what would not work is a government-driven initiative.
So why I'm talking about this and why we're having this conversation, Andrew, is take, for instance, recently, a couple of years ago, I started having things like the Sukuk bond for infrastructure and things like that people can be part of it. Is this something that the capital market can float like sort of like a diaspora investment bond?
If driven by the private sector. If driven by the private sector.
Yeah.
Right, that's the point. I don't think the federal government can be the prime driver. They can be supportive of it. But just to take it a bit further, I think one of the things we say in the paper is we actually think that the state should be reaching out to the diaspora. So if we look at For example, India, very successful diaspora. They have huge remittances, started in the 90s as their economy opened up, and they had emigration, and obviously in the U.S. technology industry and all over the world. But one of the things that happens in India is a lot of the engagement with the diaspora is at the state level, because someone's maybe more attached to the state or their region of India than to India as a whole. And I think that's very true in Nigeria as well. So we would like to see the states start their own diaspora engagement programs, so that people who are from that indigents of those states can be brought in and feel like they are, there's an interest from the state.
But sort of like a diaspora linkage affair, somebody will naturally have thought that this should be easy in Nigeria, owing to the fact that, most of those are whole key positions in Nigeria are diaspora returnees, the likes of Femi Gbajabiamila, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, used to be in America, and most of them are cross-board like that. Even the former Senate president used to be a doctor in the UK and the likes. So somebody will only think that things like that should make it seamless. Why is that not being the case?
Well, I think you go back to what we were saying earlier about the oil. I mean, I do think this belief that we're an oil economy, or an oil, we always repeat, 90% of exports are oil, 70% of the government revenue is oil. So no one was paying attention to this financial flow. And I think economists are partially to blame, because when I learned economics, when you think of your classic macroeconomics, no one thought about remittances because it wasn't a very big number. But now 3% of people in the world live in a country other than where they were born, and they transmit almost, I think, 700 billion officially. So again, if there's another 50% unofficially, there's at least $1 trillion that's being sent by remittances. But in the classic economics, a remittance is not an obligation, right? In a legal obligation, so it's not considered an export in the mathematics of it. And I think now we need to recognize that it in fact is. It's such a big flow.
So we're talking about these unofficial remittances that are not really accounted for. Is there any other untapped remittances, maybe by the cost of transaction of these remittances?
Well, I mean, one big issue is the cost of remittances. Now, why do people not use the official channels, right? So if you think of, not that I want to criticize Western Union in particular, but to send $200 by Western Union from 200 Canadian dollars to Nigeria is a very expensive proposition. And I think the World Bank has estimated that for Africa, something like the cost of remittances is up to 9%. And they've set a goal of being at 3%, because it's costing Africans in the diaspora, and then costing who they're sending to an enormous amount of money. So that's why the unofficial channels are so powerful, because effectively it's costless. Like I say on the show, maybe I'll be arrested or charged with financial crime, but I use the Aboki system. Why do I use it? It's less expensive. If I need pounds, I'm paid in Naira. If I need pounds, I use the Aboki system. It's less expensive. It's faster. And I perceive it as safer, in fact. It's never gone wrong for me. So there's no wonder of the diaspora, if you're sending amounts, 200 pounds, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds, you're going to use that sort of system, because the official channels, Bank, Western Union, are so expensive. So I think that one strategy for the government, they should be with the Sustainable Development Goals that talk about this, the World Bank. How do we get the diaspora remittance costs down?
Right. Could the silver bullet be in blockchain? That's going to be a big question we'll talk about when we come back from this quick commercial break. We're still talking to Pricewaterhouse Copers Partner and Chief Economist, Dr. Andrew Nevin. We're talking about the diaspora community and remittances. And hey, we just segued the conversation into a place now on how we can increase the ease of sending money across borders, since diaspora remittances take a big chunk and pretty much run the economy of Nigeria. But could this silver bullet be blockchain? We'll talk about that and other possibilities when we come back from this quick commercial break. Right, still the morning show here on Arise News, and we're talking to Pricewaterhouse Copers Partner and Chief Economist, Dr. Andrew Nevin. We're talking about, many things around the diaspora, remittances figures in Nigeria. And while we're talking about this, the conversation segued into how to send money, how difficult it is for people to send money from the diaspora. And we're looking at what could be the silver bullet to crack this. Could it be blockchain?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, Rufai. Yes, we think that these, let's not call them cryptocurrencies. Let's call them digital assets. So how does a digital asset work? when we transfer money, so the system we just described, so the individual, it goes to the bank, it goes to the clearing bank, it goes to the local bank, so there's many, many steps in the chain. That's one reason why it's so expensive. When you transfer a digital asset, it's peer-to-peer. And there's effectively almost no cost to it. I mean, the cost of some of the digital assets that I've seen, the technologies, is a sort of 0.0001 of a cent. So now let's talk about it specifically. So digital assets, we started with something like Bitcoin, very complex, difficult to explain, not backed by anything, so a lot of controversy. But where the conversation has moved now is asset-backed digital assets, or stable digital assets backed by a currency. So the most famous example of this, of course, is Libra. And of course, very controversial. So what was Libra?
Facebook launched recently?
Right. So, well, they haven't launched it, but they launched the idea.
Soft launch it.
So what's Libra about? Libra is a digital asset that's backed by assets that you understand. So bonds from Europe, bonds from the United States, bonds from Japan, for example, mixed there. So you can tell the value. So that's held by a custodian, and you know exactly the value of that, and it moves a little each day. So therefore, you know how many coins there are, Libra coins, so then you know exactly the value of a Libra coin. So now it can be transferred peer-to-peer without going through all the steps. So that's the basic idea. Now, how does this reduce the cost? So if I'm sitting in New York, or let's say Toronto, I'm Canadian, and I want to send some money to someone in Nigeria, I can transfer them instantly, peer-to-peer, from my wallet that holds Libra to their wallet that holds Libra. So now they have the Libra on their wallet. Now what can they do? So obviously they can turn, because the Libra value is very well known, if it existed, they could easily deposit it into a Nigerian bank. The Nigerian bank would know exactly the value of the Libra. But the other thing that would happen if we did Libra, or something like Libra, is the person would say, well, it's sitting in my wallet, I need to go spend. People would start to accept the Libra. And this is what the central banks were so concerned about, was that something that was that easy to transfer abroad, and the value is so well known, you would just start to use also for your local purchases. Why bother to put it in the bank to then go pay something
but
else?
That was the history of money when you look at it. At first we had trade by barter, then the Chinese brought in paper currency. I mean, it's pretty much an agreement of value. And when you take your phone and you transfer XYZ amount of money, it's just like a numerical transfer. I mean,
Yes.
you don't see it.
Exactly.
You know, so it's still digital money one way or the other.
Right, but the difference is that the transfer system today still uses the bank, effectively, right? It still uses multiple parties. When you have Libra in your wallet, it's your Libra. It doesn't depend on anyone else's ledger. So I won't name any bank, they're all my clients, but if I have a bank account, the reason I have a positive balance in the bank account is because the bank account says on its ledger that I have a positive bank account. I mean, if you went down to your bank and said, I have 100,000 Naira in my bank, and the bank said, no, you've got 10,000 Naira, who's going to win that argument?
The bank.
The bank.
Right? So it's their ledger. The difference with these digital assets is it doesn't depend on anyone else. That's the distributed ledger. So it's a ledger not under control of a single bank. So it's the individual, and then to transfer it, I can transfer from me to you instantly without going through all of the banks. And that's what brings the cost down.
So speaking of the banks, this might be a key role in this foreign diaspora remittances to Nigeria. How can the financial sector buy into this huge foreign remittances that we've been talking about? How can they position themselves to facilitate and accommodate it?
Well, to begin with, one of the reasons that the Naira has been so stable is because of these remittances. So if you think about the official remittances, so you have really two FX markets going on in this country. One is the NNPC transfers money to the federal allocation account, which I believe, if I may be incorrect, but I believe it was about $18 billion, so less than the remittances in 2018. So that's one market, and of course the CBN, in a sense, controls that market, and then some of those dollars are sold at 305 to various parties. And the CBN strategy is to direct the use of those dollars to the strategic uses. So they ban certain products, they've supported certain industrialization things. There's a whole other FX market, the official market, where these dollars come in, and they're in the banking system effectively, right? And then, but if I don't know if you've noticed, you will get messages from your bank in Nigeria today offering you dollars.
Yeah.
There isn't a shortage of dollars. There's enough dollars in the system, and it's one reason why the Naira has been so stable. But what can the banks do to advance this? if you look again at India or Mexico or the Philippines, the banks there have developed very fantastic products for the diaspora, recognizing this market, so connecting the market and brought the price down. And so in the Indian market, I don't believe there's as much unofficial FX transfers because the official channels are so good. Do you understand? So why do people choose an unofficial way to transfer? Because it's more effective, as I said, faster, cheaper, safer. Yeah. But to the extent the banks develop great products for the diaspora, low cost, instant, safe, what will happen is those unofficial transfers will just, because you're not going to wait till you match up with a bogey. If you want to make a transfer, you'll do that. So I think the banks can start to develop some more sophisticated products aimed at the diaspora, tying together the banking. And of course, it's not easy in today's world, particularly for Nigerians, because of KYC, AML, to get banking services. But I think that's going to be something we're going to see the banks.
I mean, what's going to be the role of NIBS in all of this facilitation?
Well, I mean, NIBS is, the center of the way our banking system works. They've been one of the most. I mean, they're not a for-profit organization, so we don't. But really, they're all. You could argue.
No, but they make some good profit, don't
but
they?
They're sort of set up under the CBN and the Bankers Committee. And but what I wanted to say was, I think that they're kind of. You could argue they're Africa's greatest fintech. I mean, the way they set up the interbank system is more sophisticated than Canadian interbanking. The BVN. Incredible innovation that's helped that. So, I mean, I think NIBS will be at the heart of it. But, I mean, what I can say about NIBS is they recognize all of these technological changes are coming, but they've always been on the cutting edge of technology in financial services here. And I expect, but they're going to have to evolve too, because, you go back to this whole conversation about the digital assets. I mean, you had the governor of the Bank of England come out, and it kind of rocked the financial world.
Mark Carney.
This is, Mark Carney. This is something that's real. And the banking system, I mean, a fundamentally different way of working in this peer-to-peer world. So how does the banking system, how does NIBS adapt to that? I mean, I think people are going to have to adapt or they're not going to survive.
I think there's also Jimmy Dimon of one of the top banks now, I forget, I think it was JP Morgan or something, that said, they actually buy digital assets and the like of things like that. But I did make mention of NIBS.
Actually, sorry, the SEC, even here, the SEC is also critical to this. I mean, the banking is the banking system, but there's also securities. You can have digital securities. I mean, if you had Libra, it would be effectively a security because it's backed by security-type assets. They've just established a new committee on digital assets. So they recognize the criticality of this.
Well, what about the NSE? Nigerian Stock Exchange, also having something of some nature for foreign remittances, like a foreign remittances market hub, where they can put their money in?
Well, I think what the NSE needs to do, again, is figure out how digital assets fit into the strategy. I mean, one of the things that happens with digital assets is, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but if you have Bitcoin, you can have it to like 10 decimal points. So it really fractionalizes, right? And because it's costless to transfer, people who have, small amounts of money can participate and save and invest much more easily than in the current system. So one of the things that digitizing assets do is also make it available globally. So if we want to have, one thing that will be very useful, we were talking about diaspora products, is the Nigerian diaspora would be logical investors in the Nigerian stock market. So the NSE should be thinking about how does it create easy ways. I mean, right now for a retail investor, so if I'm sitting in Canada and I have an account, a securities account with TD Bank, which is Canada's largest financial institution, and I'm a Nigerian Canadian, but I want to buy Airtel or MTN, there's no simple way to do it. But with the advent of digital assets, that's going to become much, much easier.
So speaking on the way the financial sector can buy into this Nigerian foreign remittances, the NSE, the SEC. I know in the reports, there was the PWC report, there were some recommendations made. Can you highlight some of those important recommendations for us?
Well, I think to begin with, yes, we are saying to the federal government, you need a strategy about this. You need an inclusion strategy. That, of course, needs to be digital in the sense you need a digital platform that you can engage Nigerians. And that might not necessarily lead to more remittances or investable remittances right away, but it will lead to more engagement with Nigerians. And of course, there are lots of platforms for diaspora, but they're not. The government's not running them. They're independent people, and they have different purposes and groups. So we're saying that as a first step. Second step, as we discussed a bit earlier, is thinking about some kind of fund, but making sure that it is private sector led at the Nigerian level, and it has a very high degree of transparency of how it's investing. If there's that fund, it also needs to be liquid in the sense that a retail investor can go in or out. So it's not like a private equity fund where large investors put in millions of dollars for 10 years. You have to be able to go in or out. Then the third recommendation is really then to drop to the state level. So the states get involved in this. And we'd like to see some states step up and say, we're prepared to do that, or maybe even on a regional basis. If you think about the Southwest, for example, the Southwest states, I mean, they have a lot in common. They could get together and create, again, this kind of engagement with the diaspora. And then to the extent that they
I think they have a platform with the Odua associations. They can just, collaborate as...
Right, but they need a really world-class digital platform. And then what they need to do behind it is sort of create opportunities for people to invest in the community, which would range from CSR, donation type things, all the way through to for-profit. Some of it might be impact investing. But whatever level of investments it's at, what the diaspora wants to see is there's some measure of governance, of monitoring. So, I mean, we've all heard stories about people sending money for years to their own relatives who are building a house, and they come to Nigeria and there's no house, right?
I know. I think we'll have to rest it there. Definitely one thing is certain, Andrew, we'll have to talk about this even more and still come because it's replete with a lot of opportunities. Thank you so much for being here, Andrew Nevin of PWC.